Well, thanks, Mark, and thank you all for coming today in whatever channels you are. And I've edited my title a little bit to because I'm going to talk quite a bit about how we have been learning, what we've been learning about how we've been learning. And I will rely on works by artists and some writers to present this and to prompt the stories that I wish to tell and provide examples of storytelling. And a lot of this presentation and the displays up on the second floor where the refreshments will be at the reception. I urge you to look at the book display and at the art display to see examples of storytelling. And this attention to the humanities and the arts is in no way to diminish the value of the science work and its impacts on society over the decades since I'll be emphasizing the Andrews Forest, but I'll put it in a broader context, I hope. And so I want to make sure that you realize that I think the value of the sciences have been major. And to complement Mark's comments in terms of, a land and people acknowledgement, here is a Clovis point found in the Andrews Forest in 1981. And it is a remarkable stone, and it is full of stories itself. The Clovis period of point production was 12 to 13,000 years ago. That small stone, about 7 centimeters long, represents incredible craftsmanship. What was the physics of the napping? And it also prompts thoughts about the utility, existential utility, food gathering. It's the earliest piece of art, an expression of aesthetics that I know of from the Andrews Forest landscape. And it also is attached to place because it's obsidian from the obsidian cliffs quarry site at the base of North Sister. So this representation of early human presence is really remarkable. At a time in the late glacial period, tree line was much lower, a very different landscape. It's interesting to try to imagine what has happened since that time. It's interesting also to think about some of the experiences we might share with those people from long ago and more recently. So this bottom image here is by a retired Forest Service ecologist, Tom Spies, who then took up night sky photography in retirement. And this is taken from the back ridge of the Andrews, 5,000 feet, looking east across the High Cascades, which is across the bottom of this image. There are the Three Sisters in the lower center. And this is night sky, and it's an inspiring view in the day, more so at night. And so I hope we are learning to see our relationship with the land in a much more complete sense. And I think some of the literature and art that has been coming out of the Andrews is representation of that perspective. So I've been doing a lot of reflecting on lessons from long-term research properties, and I've had a lot of experience with this over my career. Experimental forests of the Forest Service around the nation, long-term ecological research sites of NSF around the nation, Mount St. Helens. And so I think it's very important to do this reflecting. Reason number one is to recognize the value of the findings and affirm those values to science and to society, to learn from the different approaches in our different places and how we are different, but also what are our commonalities and complementarities, and to reflect on the learning processes themselves and how they have evolved in responses to change in society, in the land, new tools, etc. And to do this now is especially important because of the need to position ourselves for charting our very uncertain futures in these places of long-term learning. So I'm thinking in terms of constellations of places and their communities of inquiry and programs. So in the last Starker lecture, Bill Robbins celebrated the centennial of the McDonald Dunn Forest. And that was so interesting. And McDonald Dunn is one of 10 College of Forestry research forests. They're very different in size and intensity of programs. Mac Dunn is the flagship of the college's properties, which were accumulated over a succession of gifts. And with those gifts and the properties that were involved, there were objectives assigned by the gift givers. And it's been necessary to run the forests off the revenues from the harvest. And that's part of the business scheme there, but also that underwrites research, education, and other activities. And the amount of effort and size and so forth varies a great deal across that constellation of properties. And the Forest Service experimental forests and ranges, which number about 80 across the country, of which Andrews Forest is one. And I will feature the Andrews because that's what I know the most about. The Andrews is the flagship of the Forest Service's experimental forest. The National Science Foundation has supported a collection of sites in their long-term ecological research program that originated in 1980. And these sites have common funding at the same level across all the 28 sites, from the Arctic Ocean to in Antarctica, most in the 48 states, plus Alaska. And then biological field stations and marine labs and Mount St. Helens is of one of a kind, other types of properties with long-term inquiry. And there are interesting synergies within any one of these constellations and also across them. Some people, some scientists, faculty members, and others, work at multiple sites. They may have, in some cases, they've implemented experiments in multiple sites to sample environmental gradients, for example. Information management may be managed through a single site, but for multiple sites. And there may be ranges of treatments in different environments that are all part of the capitalizing on this wonderful diversity. It's an amazing collection of properties and investments of society in place-based learning. So to dial in on the Andrews a little bit, here are some of the aspects of the institutional setting. We've had the amazing good fortune to have 4 participating institutional entities that have worked very collaboratively for a long period of time. And this is not easily done. And we can see colleague sites in some of these places where they were able to work together, and then one partner or another winked out, and the integrity of the whole program really was greatly reduced. And so we have the OSU academic world working intensively at the Andrews Forest. That brings an emphasis on basic science, academic setting for education, and extension, say in the case of forestry extension, for example, as an outreach mechanism. And then we have NSF and its long-term ecological research system. And NSF is about basic science, theory development, theory testing, hypothesis testing, and it brings a high measure of credibility. And then within the LTER world, at the NSF evaluates proposals and success of programs based on intellectual merit, science findings, and broader impacts. And at the site level, NSF gives us some central themes that provide for some commonality across the 28 sites. And those include 5 core areas of research, like biodiversity and trophic interactions, biogeochemistry, carbon dynamics, disturbance, and others. And then in our proposals, which are submitted every 6 years for renewal, we have to lay out our work in these 5 core areas. We'll have a central question that helps to link them and a conceptual framework. And that's an important element of having continuity over the long time scale of the research effort. And a key thing about the NSF connection is accountability. Every time you have a renewal proposal, 6 years, at least that's what it's been in the past, we're in transition now, but there's a deep dive into the quality of the science, the rate of productivity manifests, for example, in publications, the data are publicly accessible and well documented. And so and then every 3 year, the 3-year period in the middle of a grant cycle, there's a detailed review also. So every 3 years, we're getting our tonsils inspected, and that's really critical in the continuity. Forest Service research, P&W Research Station, where I was based for most of my career, is strong on applied research and outreach through our National Forest Manager colleagues, and that's been part of it. And then the Willamette National Forest. The Andrews is 1% of the area of the Willamette National Forest. It's right in the center. And we've collaborated on communications. And the Willamette does a lot of the land tending, fire, roads, implementing experiments that involve ground disturbing activities, but also the science community learns about the challenge of managing public lands where the publics include people with strong and very different opinions about what should be done. So that's, a societal touchstone. And so there are a couple of things that bring our institutions together. We have shared objectives of the well-being of people and the land. And also our landscape, the one we have responsibilities for, are stunning. They're beautiful. They're charismatic. We each love them, though, in very different ways. And that's part of the glue for working together. And so then we have a scheme of operations. Some are prescribed to us, some have just grown up over time, some are totally instinctive. But I do note this is somewhat aspirational. We're not as consistent as we might like to be, but we're working on it. So persistence is the number one, long term. But we have to balance that with attention to the issues of the day. And so this is a challenging matter of balancing those two timescales of perspective. And we need to be very open and collaborate across disciplines, across vocabularies, across worldviews. And we need to learn from attempts to apply ideas on the ground, often by our land manager, National Forest colleagues. And we want to value surprises and be open to mistakes and learn from them. Our philosopher colleagues remind us that it's important to distinguish facts from values and be able to do argument analysis in the case of decision making. It's more than just we use the best science. And then we want to employ many mingled forms of storytelling in different venues to different audiences. And it's interesting too that the long-term research efforts, many of them were functioning. We have features in the land that are functioning as sentinels of environmental change, and then how the whole ecosystem is responding to that. So now a little bit about the lay of the land. The Andrews is this watershed in the center and left, 16,000 acres. up the Mackenzie River, established in 1948 to learn how to convert old growth to plantations. The first researchers were supposed to deliver 20 million board feet a year, and that proceeded for about 2 decades, resulting in about 20% of the old growth and mature, that is 125, 150 year age class, the old growth more like 450 to 500. To convert that old growth and mature to plantations, and to learn how to regenerate the forest and how to road the landscape for the management activities while attending to water. The Organic Act of 1897 assigned to the lands that became national forest the objective of securing favorable conditions of water flow. Timber production was part of the assignment, but it didn't pick up big time for another 50 years. And the Andrews is in the headwaters and municipal watersheds of Eugene and Corvallis. We all drink molecules of water that flow down Lookout Creek out of the Andrews, probably every day. And the Forest Service, as it established many of its experimental watersheds, it set up a subset of them to be for hydrology research. And so they're set up as this watershed is a large watershed that's, a concavity in the landscape, and water and sediment and disturbance processes and big wood and other organic matter flow through this landscape. And then some experimental watersheds are nested within them. And it's interesting, the contrast with my imagining of Mac Dunn, which is more along a ridge. Yeah, there's Oak Creek, but still there's been a patchwork accumulation of properties, whereas this is much more of a confluence of phenomena. And that influences some of the science that we do. And so experimental watersheds were set up beginning in 1952, so 4 years into the run of the Andrews Forest. And those first ones were watersheds 1, 2, and 3 in the right center. And then 2 other sets were set up in the 70s. But this is a case where similar watersheds in the native forest were monitored for inputs and exports for quite a few years before some treatments like clear cutting, broadcast burning, patch cut, maybe some roads, control watershed. Then that was done, and then we have tracked vegetation change over time, change persistence of inputs, and then the nature of the outputs in terms of nutrients, carbon, sediment, landslides, etc. And so, oops. Let me get some assistance here if I can. And we share these observations about low flows, peak flows, effects of roads, etc., with many other entities in our home watershed, the Mackenzie River Valley, through the Mackenzie River Watershed Council. And so this is an act of citizenship. And so that brings us into contact and information sharing with the City of Eugene, USGS. This is the Army Corps of Engineers, Blue River Reservoir at the bottom of this image, Weyerhaeuser. So this is an important part of how we conduct ourselves. And disturbances are an important part of this landscape. This is the 2023 Lookout Fire, photographed by Eugene ecosystem photographer, and now 12 years running fire lookout, Rob Much. And this is as this fire was proceeding to burn in a mixed severity manner over about 70% of the Andrews Forest. So disturbances have been a prominent part of the landscape and of our studies, and a constant prompt to change our perspective, to grow our perspectives. And they're wild disturbances of fire and flood, bugs, bark beetles, canopy icing, and human-imposed disturbances as well. So this is a overly complex diagram of our history. And it's on the wall in the refreshment area. I hope you could get some refreshments and look at this and look at the details. And here's some hints about how to look at it. So the bars across the top, left to right, are the tracks of work on individual topics, such as hydrology, vegetation, biodiversity. And many of those topics then have a thread that holds them together, long-term measurement programs. But within a given topic, every few years, 5 years, 10 years, the issue du jour changes due to social factors or a big flood. And everybody says, well, was logging responsible for the magnitude of the flood? There are recurrent issues and there are episodic issues. But also vertically, and in the duration of an individual increment of that LTER funding, for example, we try to do integrative activities across disciplines. So I view this as sort of a weaving of the integration activities and the persistence on a theme. Across the bottom are 3 broad categories of dominant eras in federal forestry in this region. The post-World War II to the 1990 Judge Dwyer injunctions, the timber era, and it picked up big time. But then with the injunctions and the Northwest Forest Plan, which came into effect in 94, and many people with roots in the Andrews and many other people participated in formulating that regional conservation strategy. And that really led us into what I offhandedly call the biodiversity era. But now it seems in the last decade or so, fire is saying, hey, we're entering the fire era. And so it's interesting for me to think about how our activities in the sciences and also in the arts and humanities play out over this trajectory of change. So we have many ways of communicating, of course. And of course, science pubs rank high, but I won't say much about them today. And here is a sampling of books, a small fraction of those that are on the table upstairs. And there's some labels here about the different kinds of audiences that are intended. And I urge you to look at those books and think about that, targeted audiences, and also the diversity of creators of these books. It's really quite impressive. Then I want to use this backdrop to call out 2 critical steps in the history of the Andrews and the 2 people who made those critical steps. And I'm not mentioning many names because there are way too many names to mention, but I want to say 2. One, of course, is Jerry Franklin. And the critical role I want to call out from Jerry is getting the Andrews connected with the National Science Foundation, which made it possible to go from the original objective of the applied forestry to bring in ecosystem science. And that happened when Jerry teamed up with Dick Waring and Ted Gurnis to bring the International Biological Program Coniferous Forest Biome activities to Corvallis, to OSU, and the PNW station at the Andrews Forest. That was beginning of the 70s, and then late in the 70s, Jerry was at the National Science Foundation, even as a Forest Service ecologist, and he helped the science community get the NSF to commit to the long-term ecological research program. And that was a powerful step that gave much greater continuity to the long-term efforts. And the other person is Kathy Moore. And she is the founding director of the Spring Creek Project for Ideas, Nature, and the Written Word in Philosophy. And she was instrumental in bringing humanities and arts into our sphere. And I hope the things that I'll be exposing you to today will give you a small impression of the magnitude of accomplishments that have happened in only a little over 20 years. And so the two big books on the top, the forest management and the policy ones, Jerry, his deep roots in the Andrews are critical there, and the NSF activities across the landscape, extending into streams and far beyond the trees, are critical in those manifestations of learning. And then the upper left forest understory is a collection of writings by about 30 people in the first decade or so of the writers' engagement with the Andrews Forest through the long-term ecological reflections program of slightly tongue-in-cheek riff off long-term ecological research. So I'd like to now try to bring up a video, or we're going to be able to do that. A 2-minute video created by Jeremy Monroe, who is the creator of Freshwaters Illustrated here in Corvallis.
Without this place, we wouldn't know how important Pacific Northwest rainforests are in capturing and storing water. Or how well these forests capture carbon and produce oxygen. Or what a 500-year-old tree is as wildlife habitat. We wouldn't know how much life is created when these big old trees finally fall. And what the forest floor does for the quality of our air and water. Or what those trees do to shape rivers and provide habitat for the life within them. The questions that are asked here are parts of that big question. How does our world work? This is the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. This is a place of long-term inquiry. It's a community of people who are working to understand the ecosystems that run our planet and our own role in those ecosystems.
Making listening to the
Let's see this. Back on. Great. Thanks. That last exchange of glances between Sarah Ward, the field lady, and the nude reminds me of a line from Allison Deming after a visit with a spotted owl for an hour, we share the long, slow interspecies stare, no fear, no threat, only the confusing mystery of the other. So, I mentioned the water was an important part of the Andrews program at the get-go. And then in the 70s, the stream team formed in OSU with PNW participation, a lot of other participation from around campus and much more broadly. And this community and their science remains vigorous today, extending long-term studies and employing new tools like environmental DNA to address questions such as the upstream extent of fish. And so there's just a lot of vibrance in the aquatic ecology front, and a central theme in that is forest-stream interactions. The forest shades the stream, regulating, influencing water temperature, a light to drive primary production in the stream, dropping in fine litter, part of the food base for aquatic invertebrates, and then also delivering big wood that structures habitat, for example. And so this forest-stream interaction has been a prominent theme in the Andrews work for a long time. And it's also been a central node for interdisciplinary learning. In order to think about forest-stream interactions, you've got to have your forest component, you've got to have your stream ecology component, you have to have your geomorphology, the geophysical, hydrological component, and you need to be on the same page across multiple time and space scales. And so it's interesting that this work began in the mid-70s when concerning the importance of big wooden streams from both basic and applied science fronts. How should wood be considered in the new forest practices, new of that day, 74, 75? How should big wood be considered in forest practices rules and in the Forest Service management context? But on the basic side, how should big wood be factored into the modeling of stream ecosystems, which was part of the NSF-sponsored stream ecology work of that day? So it was very cool and intriguing to see this convergence and part of the evolution of our learning. And wood now, big wood in rivers has become a central feature in stream and valley floor restoration efforts here 50 years later from that initial work. I'd like to turn now to old growth, which has been a central feature of Andrews science since the very earliest 70s. And this is, I should have said in the previous slide, as in this case, this is the work of photographer David Paul Bales, who's here, and some of his works from 3 different projects are on the wall upstairs. So I hope you'll interrogate him about his work. And this is part, as is the previous image, part of his old growth dialogue piece of work dating from 2018 or so, using a painting with light technique. And so this prompts another story about the evolution of learning, both basic and applied. So plant associations were defined by the dominant late cereal tree and by an understory species, identified in the 70s to help aid national foresters bring more ecological perspective into their forestry practices. And Dick Waring and Jerry were party to that work. And reference stands were set up. So these are vegetation plots, 100 meters by 100 meters, all the trees and downwood were mapped, had aluminum tags, like these big bruisers here in this picture, tiny little aluminum tag. And that these have been tracked over time. And so these plots were set up in the different plant associations across the sample, across the moisture temperature landscape of the whole of the Andrews and beyond. And now these have become critical sites for other kinds of long-term observations. And this information later found unexpected uses. And one of them was to develop a holistic description of the complexity of old-growth forests and associated streams. And then this information was used, this work began in about 1970, 71, 72. And it was summarized after a decade by a dozen authors. And then another decade later, people brought the lawsuit that stopped the logging of federal timber in around 90. And these reference stands continue to be used today for observations of many aspects of forest persistence and change. And also some of them were burned, so this will be very informative. And a second use of the reference stand information was that they involved long-term air temperature records under the canopy. And many of these stands were old growth, and they were observed to be stable stand conditions. No weather person would put a weather station in the understory of a big old forest, but the plant people did. But that information turned out to be very valuable because a recent paper from last year by 4 people in our group, people with very different expertise, but they worked together to publish on the 45 years of records that showed persistent summer warming. And this has a couple of implications. One is this may be a factor that's contributing to the emergence of the fire era that we seem to be occupying now. And it was also a cool example of how information, when you're saving it and you're sharing it, can be used down the road for purposes that the perpetrator of the observations never could have imagined. This is a picture by band photographer Nancy Floyd, who's been up in the Andrews for quite a few years, got a Guggenheim Award to undertake this project. And she tracked crews of young people installing experiments. And several sets of these experiments, field experiments, transplant, manipulative experiments, are addressing processes that affect interactions among species, between seedlings, and so among species, but also between seedlings and their older mother trees of the same species across environmental gradients. And so young people in various contexts, including the research experience for undergraduates program, are an important part of the research program. And in many cases, they're doing their own theses. And this is another image from David Bales from his old growth dialogue. And this is to prompt me to mention that there's a neat long-term project, which is another one of these sort of sentinel projects of observing vegetation response to environmental change, of phenology, that is the recurring seasonal events in an organism's life cycle. And so that work continues, and the general finding has been that these understory plants experience an extremely varied interannual set of conditions that lead things such as bud break to vary by many days from one year to the next. So it will be interesting to track the plant's ability to cope with the gradual summer warming, and also to ask if recent fires lead to shifts in species present, representing a catching up with the new environment that they're experiencing. This is the work of Leah Wilson out here in the atrium. She's married to great-grandson of H.J. Andrews. And she was inspired by climbing the discovery tree, this old-growth tree, hyper-instrumented tree, instrumented to observe water, energy, carbon dynamics. And this led her to create this set of 4x4 grid of 16 panels with 4 species and samples of the internal structure, the plumbing of the tree. And so I urge you to read the text panel at the base of this exhibit to learn more about it. And elsewhere in the Ecology of Forestry is this work by Deirdre Hyde, a Brit painter who's lived for over 40 years in Costa Rica. And it is a muralist. And this is a representation of some of the vertebrate and plant diversity in the Andrews. And there's been amazing work on the invertebrates. This is a list of nearly 4,000 species in the Andrews, from the stream bed to the treetops and meadows and forests. This culmination of more than a decade of collaboration with about 100 specialists from around the globe. And the artwork is by Bonnie Hall, who worked at the Art Technical Illustration interface. Here she pictures a beetle preying on the chief detritus processor, and they're perched on top of an example of the habitat in which they occur, a piece of forest floor litter. So other illustrations of this sort carry through this species list. And work on birds has been a major feature of Andrews since the early 70s. This includes in observing the amazing displacement of the northern spotted owl by habitat destruction and the incursion of the barred owl. It was seemingly unimaginable that this could happen in such quick order as the Northwest Forest Plan was being formulated in 93 and 94. And Andrews has been a hub for a lot of the owl work throughout its presence since discovery. Another facet of bird inquiry involves tracking of birds across 184 stations within the Andrews since 2009 to learn about the responses to microenvironments and species interactions. And then these data on birds have flowed into the AI-generated illumination pictured here in the center of Prax. And the magnificent Prax itself manifests broad public interest in arts and science and the natural world. This is another of David's images. It's not in the Andrews. It's in an industrial plantation south of Philomath in David's backyard, so to speak. And it's on the third floor here. And it prompts mention of the long history of silviculture work at Andrews. Studies in the early 50s focused on Doug fir regeneration. Work in the late 80s and early 90s addressed trying to find middle ground between clear cut and no cut in the name of new forestry and green tree retention. Now the key topic is management of federal land plantations in anticipation of warming and fire, the shifting issues of the day. And so we'd like to continue earlier studies and address them with new treatments, but also to implement new science in new opportunities, but we're hindered by lack of funding. The crucial ideas for management of forests in the face of climate and fire exist. This is in the infamous 200-year log decomposition experiment. It was a part of a statement to the science community in 1985, as LT era was just beginning. It's like, hey, set up experiments on the timescale of the phenomena of interest. Even if that's much longer than the funding cycle in your career or your life. And this is a familiar notion to foresters, but not very much to the ecologists, especially of that day. Another important point was in carbon budgeting, which was an important component of climate science, it's important to address the role of the dead. And our ecosystems have a lot of dead wood standing down below ground, and for various reasons. But other systems, such as in the Northeast US and in Europe, there's much less. And in many cases, it's a matter of land use legacies. And this is the work of photographer Ian Van Collar. This is one of 6 installations set up, and the perpetrator, the lead scientist of this experiment, puts his ruminations right on this image. Go check it out, it's upstairs. But then in 2023, the Lookout fire burned through 3 of the 6 sites, just as the experiment was reaching only its 20% completion point. Did this destroy the experiment or simply give it an additional purpose? How do rot and fire interact as decomposition agents over time? This is another of David Bale's images. And it's from his chronosequence component of a study called Following Fire, a Resilient Forest and Uncertain Future. And these images are a 360-degree panorama. And it's in a stand where old growth had been cut about 100 years ago, and then a young stand developed, and then the Holiday Farm fire burned through it in September of 2020, and the first image is December. And so there's a bit of scorched litter that has fallen from the trees on the blackened forest floor. The second line of images is the pano in the following summer. And already the resilience of the forest is expressed through fireweed and many other plants coming up. The third row of images is 5 years later, and we see a great toppling of the canopy collapse, and whole trees that have fallen. And this is upstairs, and you can look at the top row and the bottom row and see where trees have fallen out from the forest in the distance. And the bottom row is the green forest as of May of 2025. So you can see the subtitle of the project here with a resilient forest and an uncertain future. Does the abundance of fuel signal the threat of rebirth, for example? But the disturbance isn't done when the fire passes. This is hazard tree cutting along the main road in the upper part of the Andrews. This is a composite image. The cutter was cutting only one at a time, and he's there working on number 4 in the lower center. So this is part of the very challenging set of issues about addressing fire in the changing world and the high stakes decision making that occurs in such a dynamic landscape. And to the extent possible, we're bringing forward our long-term veg plots, our burned experimental watersheds observations, and many other things from our past, plus new work to the best of our abilities to learn from these new challenges and learning opportunities. And this is another Ian Van Collar image. In this case, a philosopher comments, and the humanities have important roles, especially in the time of fire era inquiry. Philosophers ask tough questions. philosophers attend to values. And we need to think about that a lot. And there was a great sensing of grief for the Andrews community as fire swept through the beautiful landscape, through favored sites, through study plots. The student who climbed trees, trusted her life to trees to study the bird distribution up and down trees, and her trees burned, and she couldn't revisit them in the same way. An early writer in residence at the Andrews, the poet Allison Deming, reflected on fire and the eruption of Mount St. Helens, vast disturbances, and wrote, "The forest has one rule: start over, making use of what remains." I feel that way when I read the headlines. Here's a poem from a fisher woman, Reichhold, who visited the Andrews one time in 2012 and immediately was led to this poem titled "The Andrews Experimental Forest." This forest is experimenting on us. It is totally curious. It wants to see if it can turn scientists into poets, poets into scientists, and both of them into seers. It has testing stations. The forest is recording breath and growth, words, soft and hard facts, laughter. It is graphing and grafting us. It's going to get it right. Its favorite experiment is you. And I had an inkling of this before these fires, and now I consider it just the case. So how have we learned? We've used many methods that I've described: the sustained attentiveness of field observations, field experiments, which are very tough to do in big, old forest and steep terrain. But when we've managed to do it, they catalyze synergies, but they also demand that we adapt our concept of experiment. And many new tools have come along, and that's been fascinating. And they come along to the point where some of the animal people have just published a paper on next generation natural history. These new tools make it possible to do things that old style natural history had limitations, but especially with detecting migratory patterns of individuals and things of this nature and dealing with vast data sets. But also, as we've aged and as the landscape and our experience has aged, we've become, we're doing a lived natural and human history. And the frequency of disturbances is such that we've experienced many of them. But also by bringing in many different points of view and conducting conversations in the forest, those have become important learning opportunities. And what have we learned? The forest and stream ecosystems are incredibly complex, interactive, dynamic, and wonderful. And the arts, humanities, science together have helped to make the invisible visible and the visceral intellectual understanding. So where do we go from here? I feel like we have so much to learn. We've learned a lot. We have so much to learn. And I think it's imperative that we keep doing this as best we can. And I do think we have to address grief and hope in facing the future. We have plenty of grief-inducing worries, unsurmountable challenges, attacks on science, erosion of staff and funding, climate and fire. But I think there are things to give us hope. There's a lot of beautiful land and waters out there. The art and written works are evidence of broad evidence of enthusiasm in the natural world. I was buoyed by seeing that the attempt to slash NSF budget by half or more ended up only a couple percent. And that was working through Congress. So there's a broad-based public support of this kind of stuff, I believe. And the best way to lift our spirits is to do the best we can with what remains and to revel in the joy of discovery. So to conclude, with gratitude to the land, to the first and enduring peoples, to the first and enduring science, humanities, arts people, especially to the leaders within the group and the home institutions today, because these are such difficult times. and to the whole community. So thank you very much.